The town laughed when the young widow stepped into the dust. Marybeth Carter held nothing but a folded paper and a shaking hand. Rancher Walter Briggs tipped his hat back and grinned wide. "Widow, that land isn't yours anymore." Coins clinked in his pocket. Men around the porch chuckled slow and cruel. Marybeth Carter didn't move. Wind tugged her black veil like it wanted her gone. Then a boot struck the boardwalk once. Heavy. Certain. Cowboy Daniel Crowe stepped forward from the shadow. His voice came quiet as winter iron. "Walter Briggs, you're laughing at the wrong woman today." Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Wind scraped across the dry creek street like a dull blade over old bone. Dust curled around the hitching posts and drifted against the boardwalk. Most folks stayed close to the saloon door that afternoon. Nobody wanted trouble. Especially not trouble tied to Walter Briggs. Daniel Crowe stood at the far end of the street beside the water trough. His horse drank slow. Leather reins creaked in Daniel's hand while he watched the town pretend not to see. Boot heels struck the boardwalk. Light. Uncertain. Marybeth Carter stepped into the open road wearing a widow's black dress already faded by sun. Her hands trembled around a folded sheet of paper. The wind snapped the edge of it like a loose flag. Walter Briggs leaned back in his chair outside the general store. The porch boards groaned beneath his boots. He smiled the way a man smiles when a fight is already won. "Well now," Briggs said, voice loud enough for every window in Dry Creek. "The widow returns." A few men chuckled. Coins clinked in Briggs's vest pocket when he stood. Marybeth Carter didn't step back. She held the paper tighter. "My husband paid for that land," she said, voice thin but steady. Briggs tipped his hat back. "Your husband signed it over before he passed." He reached out and tapped the folded paper in her hand. "Everything north of the creek belongs to me now." The wind moved harder down the street. A shutter banged somewhere behind the saloon. Marybeth's shoulders shook once. Not from crying. From holding it back. "Sir. That land is all I have left." The men on the porch shifted. One of them spat into the dust. Briggs laughed. Not loud. Just long enough to carry across the street. "Then you should have married a smarter man." More laughter followed. Dry. Uneasy. Daniel Crowe's boot scraped the dirt beside the trough. His horse lifted its head, water dripping from its muzzle. Daniel watched the widow standing alone in the road. Black dress. Shaking hands. A town full of men looking everywhere but at her. Briggs reached out and snatched the folded paper. It snapped sharp in the wind as he opened it. "See?" Briggs said. "Signed clear as day." He crumpled the sheet once and tossed it into the dust at Marybeth's feet. The paper skidded across the road. Marybeth stared at it like something inside her had fallen with it. That was when the boardwalk cracked once under a heavy step. Daniel Crowe crossed the street. His boots hit the dirt slow. Certain. The laughter faded. Even the wind seemed to pull back. Daniel bent down and lifted the paper from the dust. He folded it once. Carefully. Then he looked at Marybeth Carter. "Come with me," he said. Briggs scoffed. "Crowe, this doesn't concern you." Daniel didn't look at him. He only turned toward the quiet end of town where the road climbed toward open prairie. Marybeth hesitated. The saloon door creaked. A horse snorted somewhere behind the stable. Then she stepped beside Daniel. Two sets of boots moved through the dust. Behind them the town stayed silent. Far outside Dry Creek the prairie wind followed them home. The gate to Daniel Crowe's ranch groaned when he pushed it open. Loose boards rattled against the posts. The house sat low against the fading sky. Lonely. Daniel opened the door. The hinges squealed like they hadn't been used in weeks. Warm lamplight flickered faint inside. Marybeth Carter stepped across the threshold. And the empty house finally held another pair of footsteps. Morning crept slow across Daniel Crowe's ranch. Cold light pushed through the cabin window. Dust drifted in the pale beam like quiet snow. The floorboards groaned when Daniel stepped into the kitchen. The house smelled different. Not the dry scent of empty wood and stale coffee. Something warmer. Something alive. Marybeth Carter stood beside the iron stove. The kettle rattled softly as steam slipped from its lid. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. Dark hair tied loose behind her neck. She didn't look up right away. The fire snapped beneath the stove grate. A small sound. But in Daniel's house it felt loud. "You can sit," she said quietly. Daniel rested his hat on the table. The chair legs scraped the plank floor when he pulled one out. He watched her pour coffee into 2 chipped-in cups. The kettle lid clinked once when she set it aside. "Didn't mean to startle you yesterday," she said. "You didn't." She slid 1 cup across the table. Tin touched wood with a dull tap. Outside, wind dragged across the prairie grass. The ranch had known that sound for years. Lonely wind. Lonely house. Daniel lifted the cup. The heat pressed into his palms. He hadn't held warm coffee in a quiet kitchen with another soul in a long time. Marybeth stood by the stove a moment longer. Then she sat across from him. Neither spoke. The clock on the wall ticked slow. Outside, a loose gate creaked against its hinge. After a while Marybeth reached into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out the folded paper Daniel had taken from the dust. The creases were still sharp. She placed it carefully on the table. "You didn't ask about it." Daniel shrugged. "Didn't seem the time." Her fingers rested on the edge of the paper. Light from the window caught faint lines across the page. Ink marks. Survey scratches. Daniel noticed them again. Not just writing. Something more. Marybeth folded it once and slipped it back into her pocket. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel drank the rest of his coffee. The chair creaked when he stood. Fence broke along the north pasture. Marybeth rose too. "I can help." Daniel shook his head once. "It's cold work." She gave a small tired smile. "I've known cold before." The door groaned when Daniel pushed it open. Wind rushed in hard and sharp. The warmth of the stove slipped out into the morning. Marybeth stepped onto the porch beside him. The boards cracked softly under their weight. Cattle moved slow beyond the frost-silver grass. Daniel grabbed his coat from a nail on the wall. Behind him the stove fire popped again. Alive. Warm. Marybeth stood in the doorway watching the field. Her breath drifted pale in the cold air. "Your ranch is quiet," she said. Daniel looked out across the empty land. "Quiet's easier." She didn't answer. Just nodded once. The barn door groaned when Daniel slid it open. The horse inside stamped against the floor. Leather tack rattled on the wall. Marybeth stepped inside carefully. Her hand brushed the rough wood beam. "You built all this alone?" Daniel tightened a saddle strap. "Had help once." The horse snorted softly. Dust floated through the dim barn light. Marybeth moved toward the tool rack. She picked up a coil of wire. "You mind if I mend the chicken fence while you ride north?" Daniel looked at her. "You know how?" "My husband taught me before winter." Daniel studied her a moment. Then nodded once. She stepped back outside. The barn door thumped shut behind her. Silence settled again. But not the same silence Daniel knew before. This one carried the sound of her boots crossing the yard. Wire clinking against her tools. The ranch breathing. Daniel rode north along the pasture fence. Frost cracked beneath the horse's hooves. Wind moved hard through the grass. The broken rails waited near the hill. Daniel dismounted. The wood snapped under his hand when he lifted it. He worked without hurry. Hammer strikes echoed across the empty land. Cold bit through his gloves. For a moment the ranch felt the same as always. lonely. Then the wind shifted. Faint. Far off. Hoofbeats. Daniel froze. He listened. The sound drifted from the south ridge. Slow riders. More than one. He stepped to the rise beside the pasture. 3 figures moved along the distant road. Dark shapes against the pale sky. One of them wore a wide black hat Daniel recognized. Walter Briggs. The riders didn't turn toward the ranch. They passed along the ridge. But Daniel watched until they vanished beyond the hills. The hammer hung loose in his hand. Cold settled deeper into the air. Back at the ranch yard, Marybeth worked beside the chicken fence. Wire pulled tight between the posts. The metal sang faint when she twisted it. The coop door creaked. Hens clucked softly in the straw. Marybeth wiped her hands on her skirt. She looked toward the open prairie. The land stretched quiet and wide. Too quiet. Wind brushed the grass like whispering voices. She touched the folded paper in her pocket again. Her fingers lingered there. Then she returned to the fence. Wire tightened. Wood tapped into place. The ranch slowly gathered small sounds again. Hammering from the hill. Chickens rustling in straw. The low breath of cattle drifting across the pasture. Daniel returned near dusk. The sky burned orange behind the hills. Cold shadows filled the yard. He slid down from the saddle. The porch boards creaked when he climbed the steps. Warm light glowed through the window. Daniel paused. Inside the cabin the stove crackled strong. Pots clinked softly. The smell of stew drifted through the doorframe. Daniel pushed the door open. The hinges squealed. Marybeth stood at the stove again. Steam curled up toward the rafters. She turned slightly when he stepped inside. "You fixed the fence?" "Most of it." She nodded toward the table. "Then supper's ready." Daniel sat slowly. The chair scraped the floor again. Marybeth set a bowl in front of him. The spoon tapped the rim once. Outside the wind moved across the prairie. Cold. Restless. Inside the cabin the fire snapped bright and warm. But far beyond the ranch hills a rider watched the thin line of smoke rising from Daniel Crowe's chimney. And the quiet valley no longer belonged only to the 2 people inside that house. The stove cracked awake before sunrise. Orange firelight climbed the cabin walls. Warmth drifted through the small kitchen. Outside, frost clung to the window glass like pale lace. Marybeth Carter stood beside the stove stirring a pot slowly. The wooden spoon scraped the iron bottom in quiet circles. Daniel Crowe stepped in from the porch. Cold air slipped in behind him. The door groaned shut. Snow melt dripped from the brim of his hat. Marybeth glanced over her shoulder. "You're up early." Daniel hung his coat on the wall peg. Cattle needed checking. His boots thudded softly across the floorboards. The warmth of the stove wrapped around him. Marybeth poured coffee into a tin cup. The liquid steamed in the cold room air. She slid the cup across the table. Daniel nodded once. Outside the wind whispered across the prairie grass. Inside the clock ticked slow and steady. Marybeth set a plate of bread on the table. The crust cracked softly when Daniel tore a piece. "You cook like you've been here years," he said. A small smile touched her face. "Keeping busy keeps the mind quiet." Daniel studied her a moment. She kept stirring the pot. Steam rose around her shoulders like morning fog. The cabin no longer sounded hollow. The kettle rattled softly. The spoon tapped the rim. The floor creaked when Daniel shifted his weight. Little sounds. Warm sounds. Daniel took another sip of coffee. Then he noticed the folded paper again. It sat near the edge of the table. Marybeth's fingers rested beside it without touching. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Map?" Marybeth hesitated. Her hand slid over the paper. "Something like that." She folded it smaller and tucked it back into her dress pocket. The movement was careful. Protective. Daniel didn't push. Outside, a loose shutter clapped once against the wall. The sudden noise cut the quiet. Marybeth flinched slightly. Daniel stood. "I'll fix that." He stepped onto the porch. The wind hit harder out there. Cold. Sharp. The shutter banged again. Daniel caught it with one hand and tightened the hinge. The metal groaned under the screw. When he finished, the porch fell quiet again. Across the prairie, a thin line of riders moved along the distant ridge. Daniel squinted into the pale morning light. 3 men. Maybe 4. Too far to see clearly. But they rode slow. Watching the valley. Daniel's jaw tightened. The riders turned away after a moment. Their silhouettes melted into the hills. Daniel stepped back inside. Warm air wrapped around him again. Marybeth had placed 2 bowls on the table. The smell of stew filled the room. She sat down carefully. "You look like you saw something," she said. "Just riders." Her spoon paused halfway to the bowl. "From town?" Daniel shrugged. "Hard to tell." They ate in silence. The stew was thick and warm. Outside, the wind rattled the fence posts. Marybeth finished first. She stood and carried the bowls to the wash basin. Water splashed softly against the metal pan. Daniel watched her work. Her movements were steady. Used to work. Used to quiet. "You don't have to earn your stay every minute," he said. She shook her head slightly. "My husband used to say idle hands invite trouble." Daniel leaned back in the chair. The wood creaked under his weight. "Your husband sounds like a careful man." Marybeth's hands paused in the wash water. "For a while. He was." She rinsed the last bowl. The basin rang softly when she set it down. Daniel stood and grabbed his coat. "Fence line needs checking again." Marybeth wiped her hands dry. "I'll finish the garden patch." Daniel opened the door. Cold wind rushed through the cabin again. Marybeth stepped outside behind him. The morning sun climbed over the hills. Golden light touched the frost. The ranch looked alive. Marybeth knelt near the small patch of dirt beside the house. She pressed seeds into the soil. The ground was still cold beneath her fingers. Daniel saddled the horse near the barn. Leather straps creaked as he tightened them. The horse snorted warm breath into the air. Marybeth worked quietly. The soil crumbled between her hands. For a moment the ranch felt peaceful. Almost gentle. Then the sound came. Hoofbeats. Not distant this time. Closer. Marybeth lifted her head. 3 riders moved along the road beyond the fence line. Their horses walked slow. Watching. Marybeth stood slowly. Her fingers brushed the folded paper in her pocket again. The riders didn't stop. They passed the ranch without speaking. But one of them turned his head toward the house. Long enough to see the smoke rising from the chimney. Long enough to see Marybeth standing in the yard. Daniel watched them ride away from the barn door. The leather reins tightened in his hand. The horse shifted under him. Marybeth walked slowly back toward the porch. The wind tugged at her dress. "Friends of yours?" she asked. Daniel shook his head once. "No." The riders disappeared beyond the ridge. Silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Now it carried weight. Marybeth stepped inside the cabin. The stove still burned bright. The fire cracked softly in the iron belly. Warmth filled the room again. But outside, somewhere beyond the hills, men had begun to notice the lonely ranch with smoke rising from its chimney. And the quiet life growing inside it. The wind softened with the coming of spring. Grass began pushing through the frost along the lower pasture. Morning sunlight slipped through the cabin window and settled warm across the kitchen table. Marybeth Carter kneaded dough beside the stove. Flour dust drifted in the air like pale smoke. The wooden board creaked softly under her hands. Daniel Crowe sat near the window sharpening a knife. Steel slid against the whetstone with a steady whisper. Outside, a rooster crowed from the chicken yard. A sound that had not lived on the ranch for years. Marybeth glanced toward the window. "Didn't know your place kept chickens." Daniel shrugged. "Didn't, until you fixed the coop." She pressed the dough flat. The board knocked once against the table. "You had the lumber." Daniel looked toward the yard. Sunlight glinted off the fence wires Marybeth had strung tight the week before. Cattle moved slow across the pasture. Quiet. Orderly. A ranch breathing again. Daniel wiped the knife blade clean with a cloth. "You worked that garden patch yesterday?" Marybeth nodded. "Potatoes mostly." Daniel tilted his head. "You planning to stay long enough to harvest them?" Marybeth paused. Her hands rested on the dough. A faint smile touched her face. "If the ground lets me." The stove popped as a log shifted in the fire. Warmth rolled through the kitchen. The cabin felt smaller now. Fuller. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The floorboards groaned beneath the shift. Outside, the wind rattled the barn door once. Then came the distant sound. Hoofbeats. Daniel's head lifted. Slow. Measured. One rider. Maybe two. Marybeth wiped flour from her hands. She stepped toward the window beside Daniel. A lone rider moved along the road beyond the fence. Dark coat. Wide hat. The horse walked easy but deliberate. Daniel watched in silence. The rider slowed near the fence line. Turned his head toward the house. Then rode on. Marybeth exhaled quietly. "From town again?" Daniel nodded once. "Briggs's men." The wind carried the fading hoofbeats across the valley. The quiet returned. But the air felt colder. Marybeth returned to the table. She shaped the dough into a loaf. The oven door squealed when she opened it. Firelight glowed orange inside. She slid the pan into the heat. The smell of baking bread soon filled the cabin. Daniel stood. The chair legs scraped softly behind him. "I'll check the south pasture." Marybeth brushed flour from her dress. "I'll finish the washing." Daniel stepped outside. Cold wind brushed across the yard. The barn door creaked slowly in its hinge. He crossed the field toward the fence line. The prairie stretched wide and empty beyond the hills. But Daniel felt the eyes on the ranch again. The feeling lingered like a shadow. Back inside the cabin, the bread crackled in the oven. Marybeth pumped water into the wash basin. The metal handle squealed with each push. Water splashed against the tin basin. She dipped a cloth and began scrubbing Daniel's work shirts. The fabric smelled of dust and horse sweat. Honest labor. Outside, a board popped sharply. Marybeth paused. The sound came from the porch. Heavy boots stepping across the planks. Her heart tightened. She wiped her hands quickly and moved to the door. The latch lifted slowly. The door opened with a long creak. Daniel stepped inside. Marybeth released a breath. "You're back early." Daniel nodded. "Fence held fine." He set his hat on the table. But his eyes remained on the window. "What is it?" she asked. Daniel walked to the door again and looked toward the ridge. Tracks. Fresh horse tracks cutting across the dirt road near the ranch gate. More than one rider now. He stepped back inside. "They're getting closer." Marybeth stood still. The wash water rippled quietly in the basin. "You think they'll come here?" Daniel didn't answer at first. The stove snapped softly behind them. The smell of warm bread filled the room again. Finally he spoke. "They're testing how alone we are." Marybeth reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed the folded paper again. The same careful motion. Daniel noticed. "You still carrying that thing everywhere?" Marybeth nodded slowly. "It matters more than they think." Daniel studied her. Briggs wouldn't keep sending riders unless he believed that. Marybeth walked to the oven. She pulled the loaf free. The crust cracked under the knife when she sliced it. Steam rose warm into the air. She set 2 pieces on the table. Daniel sat again. The chair creaked beneath him. Outside, the wind moved softly through the grass. The ranch looked peaceful under the afternoon sun. Marybeth placed the bread between them. "For a quiet place," she said softly, "your ranch is starting to attract a lot of attention." Daniel broke the bread in half. Warm crumbs scattered across the table. He looked toward the hills. "They'll come sooner or later." Marybeth lowered herself into the chair across from him. "And when they do?" Daniel took a slow bite. He chewed calmly, then wiped his hands on the cloth beside his plate. "When they do," he said quietly, "they'll find this house isn't empty anymore." Outside, far beyond the valley, a rider stopped his horse on the ridge. He looked down at the thin trail of smoke rising from Daniel Crowe's chimney, then turned the horse back toward town. Morning came gray and restless. Clouds hung low over the valley. Cold wind rattled the loose boards along Daniel Crowe's barn. Inside the cabin, the stove burned steady. Fire cracked softly behind the iron grate. Marybeth Carter stood by the table slicing bread. The knife tapped the wooden board in slow rhythm. Daniel sat near the window with a tin cup of coffee. The warmth filled the small room. For a moment the ranch felt quiet again. Almost peaceful. Then the dog outside barked once. Sharp. Alert. Daniel's head turned toward the door. Marybeth froze with the knife in her hand. Hoofbeats followed. Heavy. More than one horse. The sound rolled up the dirt road like distant thunder. Daniel stood slowly. The chair legs scraped the floor. Marybeth set the knife down. Neither spoke. The hoofbeats stopped just beyond the fence. Leather creaked. A saddle horn knocked against wood. Then a voice carried across the yard. "Crowe." Daniel recognized it immediately. Walter Briggs. Daniel pushed the door open. Cold air rushed into the cabin. Marybeth stepped back from the doorway but remained close enough to see. 3 horses stood in the yard. Walter Briggs sat tall in the saddle. 2 men flanked him. Rifles rested across their laps. The horses snorted clouds of steam into the morning air. Daniel stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned under his boots. Briggs smiled like a man greeting an old friend. "Morning, Crowe." Daniel leaned against the porch rail. "Walter." Briggs looked toward the cabin window. Marybeth's shadow moved behind the curtain. "Seems you took in a guest." Daniel said nothing. Wind pushed across the yard. The barn door thumped softly against its hinge. Briggs tipped his hat back. "Town's talking about it." Daniel's voice stayed flat. "Town talks about plenty." Briggs laughed. A short sound. Dry. "Well now. This one interests me." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. The document snapped once in the wind. "You know what this is, Crowe?" Daniel didn't answer. Briggs waved the paper slightly. "A court notice." The riders behind him shifted in their saddles. Leather straps creaked. Briggs continued. "That widow you're hiding owes land taxes and debt payments." He pointed the paper toward the cabin. "Which makes her property mine by law." Marybeth stepped onto the porch behind Daniel. The door squealed as it swung wider. Briggs's eyes sharpened. "Well now." Marybeth stood still. Cold wind pulled at the hem of her dress. "That land isn't yours," she said. Briggs smiled wider. "It will be." Daniel shifted slightly. The porch boards creaked beneath him. Briggs leaned forward in the saddle. "I came to collect what belongs to me." Marybeth's hand slipped into her pocket. Her fingers touched the folded paper hidden there. Daniel noticed. Briggs noticed too. His smile thinned. "You still carrying that old scrap?" Briggs asked. Marybeth said nothing. The wind moved harder across the yard. Loose tin rattled along the barn roof. Briggs's horse pawed the dirt. Daniel stepped down from the porch. Boots hit the ground with a dull thud. He stopped halfway between the house and the riders. "Walter," Daniel said quietly. Briggs raised an eyebrow. "That woman stays here." Briggs tilted his head. "Crowe, you planning to challenge legal papers now?" Daniel folded his arms. "Just telling you how things stand." The riders behind Briggs shifted again. One of them spat into the dirt. The valley went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Briggs studied Daniel carefully. "You always were stubborn." He tapped the court paper against his glove. "But law doesn't bend for stubborn men." Marybeth stepped down from the porch. The boards creaked behind her. She stood beside Daniel. Cold air whipped across the yard. The two of them faced the riders together. Briggs chuckled. "You planning to protect her, Crowe?" Daniel didn't blink. "Yes." Briggs leaned back in the saddle. "Well then." He folded the paper slowly. The crisp sound carried across the yard. "I'll give you 2 days." Marybeth frowned. "For what?" Briggs's smile returned. 2 days to send her away." His eyes flicked toward Daniel again. "After that, I return with the sheriff." The words settled heavy in the air. The horses shifted impatiently. Leather creaked. Daniel stood silent. Briggs turned his horse. Dirt crunched beneath the hooves. The two riders followed him toward the road. Halfway to the gate, Briggs stopped. He looked back once. "Oh, Crowe." Daniel didn't move. Briggs's voice carried across the wind. "Sheriff doesn't like men who interfere with court orders." He tapped the brim of his hat. "Think about that." The riders disappeared down the road. The hoofbeats faded slowly into the hills. Silence returned to the ranch. But it wasn't the gentle quiet from before. It felt heavier. Colder. Marybeth looked toward the empty road. Her voice came soft. "You believe he'll bring the sheriff?" Daniel watched the ridge where the riders vanished. "Yes." Wind pushed against the porch posts. The barn door creaked again. Marybeth stepped back toward the cabin. Daniel followed. Inside, the stove burned warm. Fire snapped quietly in the iron belly. Marybeth removed the folded paper from her pocket. She laid it on the table. The old incline stretched across the page. Maps. Survey marks. Daniel leaned closer. "You planning to show that to the sheriff?" Marybeth shook her head slowly. "Not yet." Daniel looked up. "Why?" Marybeth folded the paper again. Her voice lowered. "Because when Walter Briggs realizes what it proves." She slipped the paper back into her pocket. "He won't send the sheriff." The wind rattled the cabin window. Marybeth met Daniel's eyes. "He'll send something worse." Night settled heavy over the valley. Cold pressed against the cabin walls. Wind slipped through the grass with a low whisper. Inside, the stove glowed orange. Fire snapped in quiet bursts. Marybeth Carter sat at the table with the folded paper spread before her. Lamplight trembled across the inked lines. Survey marks. Old boundaries. Proof of something bigger than a widow's claim. Daniel Crowe leaned against the window frame. His rifle rested in the crook of his arm. Outside, darkness swallowed the pasture. "You should sleep," Marybeth said softly. Daniel didn't move. "Not tonight." The wind brushed the side of the cabin. A loose shutter knocked once. Marybeth folded the paper again. Her fingers moved carefully along the creases. "You think Briggs meant what he said?" Daniel's eyes stayed on the dark fields. "Yes." Marybeth placed the paper back in her pocket. The chair creaked when she stood. The kettle rattled softly as she poured water. Steam rose warm into the cool room. "You've done enough for me already." Daniel glanced back at her. "You're still here." Marybeth met his gaze. "Yes." Outside, a horse snorted faintly from the barn. The sound carried through the quiet. Daniel opened the door. Cold night air rushed inside. He stepped onto the porch. The stars burned sharp above the hills. The ranch lay silent. But silence on the prairie never meant safety. Daniel listened. The wind moved. Grass whispered. Then a distant hoofbeat. One. Then another. Far away, but coming closer. Daniel stepped down from the porch. Boots hit the dirt with a dull thud. He walked toward the barn. The horse inside stamped once against the wood floor. The barn door groaned when Daniel pushed it open. Warm animal breath filled the dim space. Daniel stepped to the stall window. He looked toward the ridge. 3 riders stood silhouetted against the moonlight. Watching. They didn't move. Didn't call out. Just sat there on the hill like dark statues. Daniel's hand tightened on the rifle. The riders turned slowly. Their horses carried them back into the darkness. Gone again. But the message stayed. Daniel returned to the cabin. Marybeth stood by the stove. The lamplight flickered across her face. You saw them? Daniel nodded. Briggs's men. She wrapped her arms around herself. Cold had followed him inside. How long were they there? Long enough. The stove popped as a log shifted. Warmth pushed back the chill. Marybeth stepped closer to the fire. You should send me away before they come back. Daniel shook his head. No. Marybeth looked up. Daniel. Not happening. His voice stayed quiet. But solid. Marybeth lowered her gaze. Silence filled the room again. Only the ticking clock and the fire's soft crackle. Morning came gray and restless. Wind scraped dust across the yard. Daniel saddled his horse beside the barn. Leather straps creaked under his hands. Marybeth stood near the porch watching. You're riding to town, she said. Daniel nodded. Need supplies. Marybeth's voice stayed calm. They'll be waiting there. Daniel tightened the saddle strap. Maybe. Marybeth stepped down into the yard. The dirt crunched beneath her boots. You don't have to do this alone. Daniel looked at her. You already did your part. Marybeth shook her head. I haven't even started. Daniel swung into the saddle. The horse shifted under him. Wind pushed across the open field. Keep the door locked, he said. Marybeth nodded once. Daniel turned the horse toward the road. The ranch faded behind him as he rode. The valley looked peaceful from a distance. Sunlight spilled across the grass. But trouble traveled faster than sunlight. Dry Creek appeared quiet when Daniel reached it. The saloon doors hung open. A wagon rattled slowly down the street. But conversation stopped when Daniel rode in. Eyes followed him. Men leaned against the boardwalk rail. Watching. Daniel tied his horse to the hitching post. The rope creaked tight. He stepped onto the boardwalk. Boots struck the planks with slow rhythm. Inside the general store, the bell above the door rang. The shopkeeper looked up nervously. Daniel placed a sack on the counter. Flour, salt, coffee. The man nodded quickly. While he packed the items, Daniel heard the whisper. From the far end of the room. 2 ranch hands speaking low. Briggs already told the sheriff. Said Crowe's hiding stolen land papers. Daniel said nothing. But the words settled heavy in the air. The shopkeeper handed him the sack. Careful riding home today, the man muttered. Daniel stepped back onto the street. Sunlight glared against the dust. Across the road, Walter Briggs stood outside the saloon. 2 riders beside him. Briggs smiled slowly when he saw Daniel. Well now. His boots thudded across the boardwalk. Crowe. Daniel didn't stop walking. Briggs's voice followed him. You still keeping that widow? Daniel reached his horse. Untied the rope. Yes. Briggs chuckled. You should listen to town gossip more often. Daniel swung into the saddle. Briggs stepped closer. The street went quiet. Sheriff Carter will be riding out tomorrow morning, Briggs said. Daniel looked down at him. For what? Briggs tapped his vest pocket. Recovery of stolen property. His eyes gleamed. Which includes that paper your widow's hiding. Daniel stared at him a moment longer. Then turned the horse toward the road. Behind him Briggs called out. Tell her to have it ready. Daniel rode out of town without answering. The wind picked up again across the prairie. Cold. Restless. Back at the ranch, smoke drifted from the cabin chimney. Marybeth stood on the porch watching the empty road. Waiting. The wind rattled the gate. And somewhere far behind Daniel Crowe, a sheriff was already preparing to ride. The wind turned bitter after sunset. Cold slid across the prairie like a slow knife. Inside the cabin the stove burned steady. Orange light flickered along the wooden walls. Marybeth Carter stood near the window. Her hands wrapped around a warm tin cup. Steam drifted upward. Outside, darkness swallowed the pasture. She listened. The ranch had its own language now. Fence wire humming in the wind. Cattle shifting in the grass. The barn door knocking softly against its latch. Then something else. A horse snorted. Close. Marybeth set the cup down. The tin rang faint against the table. She stepped toward the door. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight. She opened it slowly. Cold night air rushed into the cabin. The yard lay dark and still. But near the fence, a shadow moved. Marybeth's breath caught. A rider sat motionless beyond the gate. The moon caught the edge of his hat. Another rider appeared beside him. Then a third. They waited. Watching the house. Marybeth closed the door quietly. The latch clicked. Inside the fire popped once. Warmth pressed gently against the cold creeping through the walls. She moved to the table. Her fingers touched the folded paper in her pocket. The old creases pressed into the fabric. Outside, a horse shifted again. Hoof scraping dirt. Marybeth whispered toward the empty room. Daniel, hurry. The wind pushed hard against the roof. The cabin groaned softly. Far across the valley another sound carried through the night. Hoofbeats. Fast. Daniel Crowe rode hard along the dark road. The saddle leather creaked with every stride. Cold air cut across his face. The sack of supplies thumped against the horse's flank. The town dust still clung to his coat. And Briggs's words clung harder. Sheriff Carter will be riding out tomorrow morning. Daniel urged the horse faster. The ranch lights flickered faint in the distance. But something else moved near the yard. Shapes. Dark. Waiting. Daniel slowed the horse. His hand slid to the rifle strapped along the saddle. 3 riders. Standing near the fence. Watching the cabin. Daniel guided the horse through the low grass. Quiet. The wind covered his approach. He dismounted near the barn. Boots touched the dirt without a sound. Inside the barn the horse snorted softly. Daniel rested a hand against its neck. Easy. Outside the riders shifted again. One of them laughed. Low. Mean. Daniel stepped to the barn door. The moon lit the yard just enough. Walter Briggs's men. 2 by the gate. 1 leaning against the fence post. The man by the fence kicked at the dirt. She's still inside? Where else she gonna run? Another voice answered. Briggs himself wasn't there. But his message was. Daniel raised the rifle slowly. The barn door creaked faint beneath his shoulder. The rider closest to the gate turned his head. Did you hear? The rifle cocked. A sharp metal click in the night. All 3 riders froze. Daniel stepped into the moonlight. His voice carried across the yard. Evening. The men stared. Wind pushed across the prairie grass. One rider lifted his hand slightly from the reins. "Well now." Daniel kept the rifle steady. "What are you doing on my land?" The man by the fence shrugged. "Just checking the view." Daniel's eyes didn't move. "View's over." The horses stamped nervously. Leather straps creaked. One rider leaned forward. "Briggs says that widow belongs to him." Daniel took a step closer. Boot crushed gravel beneath his heel. "Briggs says plenty." The man smirked. "Sheriff will be here tomorrow." Daniel nodded once. "Then you can come back tomorrow." The riders looked at each other. Uncertain. Daniel lifted the rifle slightly higher. Moonlight glinted along the barrel. "Tonight, you ride." Silence hung heavy. Then the man by the fence spat into the dirt. "Fine." He swung into the saddle. The other two followed. The horses turned toward the road. One rider paused at the gate. He looked back once. "You can't guard her forever." Daniel didn't answer. The riders kicked their horses into motion. Hoofbeats faded down the dark road. The valley grew quiet again. Daniel lowered the rifle slowly. Behind him the cabin door opened. Marybeth stepped onto the porch. Lamplight spilled into the yard. "You're back." Daniel nodded. She looked toward the empty road. "They came while you were gone." "I saw." Marybeth walked down the steps. Cold wind tugged at her hair. "You scared them off." Daniel shook his head. "Not scared." Marybeth studied his face. "They'll come again." Daniel glanced toward the hills. "Yes." She folded her arms against the cold. "What happens when the sheriff comes?" Daniel rested the rifle against the porch rail. The wood creaked softly. "We'll deal with it." Marybeth stepped closer. Her voice dropped. "They'll try to take the paper." Daniel looked at her. The firelight from the cabin touched the edge of her face. "Then we don't let them." Marybeth exhaled slowly. The wind rustled the grass around them. The ranch felt smaller tonight. More exposed. Daniel lifted the sack of supplies. The door hinges squealed as he pushed it open. Warm firelight greeted them again. Marybeth stepped inside. Daniel followed. The cabin filled with the smell of wood smoke and bread. But outside the prairie wind carried the fading echo of hoofbeats toward town. And by morning, those riders would return. Not alone. Not quiet. Morning came hard and cold. Gray clouds pressed low over the valley. Wind dragged across the prairie grass with a restless hiss. Daniel Crowe stood on the porch rail tightening a saddle strap. The leather creaked under his hands. Below the steps Marybeth Carter split kindling beside the wood pile. The axe struck the log. Crack. Another clean strike. Crack. The sound echoed across the quiet yard. The stove inside the cabin burned steady. Smoke drifted from the chimney into the pale sky. Daniel paused. He listened. At first there was only the wind. Then came the sound. Hoofbeats. Slow. Heavy. More than a few. Marybeth lowered the axe. The handle thumped softly against the ground. Daniel stepped down from the porch. Dust shifted beneath his boots. Across the road a line of riders crested the hill. 5 horses. 2 ranch hands. Walter Briggs in the center. And beside him, a man wearing a silver sheriff's badge. Sheriff Carter. The riders moved into the yard without hurry. Their horses snorted clouds of breath into the cold air. Leather creaked. Metal jingled softly against saddle rings. Daniel stood still near the gate. Marybeth stepped beside him. The wind tugged at her coat. Briggs tipped his hat back. "Well now." Sheriff Carter looked between them. His voice stayed calm. "Morning, Crowe." Daniel nodded once. "Sheriff." Carter pulled a folded document from his coat. The paper snapped once in the wind. "I've got a court order here." Marybeth's hand slipped into her pocket. Her fingers touched the folded map hidden there. Carter continued. Property belonging to Walter Briggs. He looked directly at Marybeth. And the recovery of documents believed to be stolen. Silence settled across the yard. The barn door creaked slowly behind them. Wind rattled the fence wire. Briggs smiled faintly. Told you I'd come back. Daniel stepped forward one pace. Boot crushed gravel beneath his heel. That land isn't yours. Briggs laughed softly. Court says it is. Sheriff Carter unfolded the paper. Ink marks stretched across the page. Marybeth Carter, he said carefully. Your order to surrender the disputed document. Marybeth didn't move. Her voice came steady. No. The word hung sharp in the cold air. One of Briggs's riders shifted in the saddle. His horse stamped the dirt. Carter lowered the paper slightly. Ma'am. Refusing a lawful order will cause trouble. Daniel's voice came low beside her. She's not giving you anything. Briggs leaned forward in the saddle. Oh, I think she will. He pointed toward Marybeth's coat pocket. That paper doesn't belong to her. Marybeth stepped forward. The wind whipped her hair across her face. It proves the valley belongs to my husband. Briggs's smile thinned. Your husband signed it away. Marybeth shook her head. No. Her hand pulled the folded paper from her pocket. The old parchment fluttered once in the wind. Survey lines scratched across the surface. Sheriff Carter frowned. What is that? Marybeth held it high enough for everyone to see. The original land deed. The writer shifted. Briggs's expression hardened. Marybeth's voice carried across the yard. It shows Walter Briggs altered the county records. A long silence followed. The wind pushed dust across the ground. Sheriff Carter stepped down from his horse. Boots hit the dirt with a dull thud. Let me see that. Marybeth walked forward slowly. She handed him the paper. Carter studied it under the pale light. The ranch hands leaned forward in their saddles. Briggs stayed very still. Carter traced the faded ink with his finger. This seal. He looked up sharply. Where did you get this? Marybeth's voice stayed calm. My husband kept it hidden. Briggs's horse stamped once. Daniel noticed the rancher's hand tightening around the reins. Carter folded the paper carefully. He turned toward Briggs. Walter, this looks like the original survey seal. Briggs forced a laugh. Old paper can say anything. Carter's eyes narrowed. It also says the North Valley was never sold. The wind fell silent for a moment. Even the horses seemed to hold still. Briggs's smile vanished. That document is a lie. Daniel stepped forward beside Marybeth. The porch boards creaked behind them. No, Daniel said quietly. It's truth. Briggs's face reddened. You think a scrap of paper will ruin me? He snapped the reins sharply. His horse reared slightly. The other riders moved closer. The tension snapped like a pulled rope. Daniel's rifle came up in one smooth motion. The metal glinted in the weak sunlight. Enough. His voice cut through the yard. Cold. Solid. The riders froze. Sheriff Carter lifted a hand slowly. Hold it. Briggs glared across the yard. You're pointing a rifle at a lawful claim. Daniel didn't lower the weapon. You're not taking her. Wind rushed through the pasture again. Grass bent low under its force. Marybeth stood behind Daniel now. Silent. Steady. Sheriff Carter looked between the rifle, the document, and Walter Briggs. His jaw tightened. Briggs leaned forward in the saddle. You can't stop this, Crowe. Daniel's voice stayed calm. Watch me. The yard fell silent again. Cold air pressed against the house walls. The stove inside cracked softly. Warmth waited beyond the door. But outside, the valley balanced on a single moment. And no one moved. The wind moved slow across the yard. Dust slid along the ground in thin lines. Daniel Crowe's rifle stayed steady in his hands. The barrel pointed straight at Walter Briggs. No one spoke. Sheriff Carter stood between them holding the old document. The paper rustled softly in the breeze. Marybeth Carter watched the sheriff's face. Waiting. Briggs shifted in the saddle. Leather creaked. "You planning to read the thing all day?" he said. Sheriff Carter ignored him. His eyes moved across the faded ink again. The seal pressed into the corner of the page caught the light. A deep stamp. Old county wax. Carter exhaled slowly. "This isn't just a land deed." Briggs scoffed. "Of course it is." Carter lifted the paper higher. "No." His voice turned sharper. "This is the original Valley Charter." The riders exchanged uneasy looks. Wind rattled the barn door behind them. Marybeth stepped forward. "My husband found it in the courthouse archives." Briggs laughed loudly. "That's a lie." Marybeth's voice stayed calm. "He was the survey clerk." Sheriff Carter looked up quickly. "Samuel Carter?" Marybeth nodded. The sheriff's brow tightened. "Your husband was the man reviewing the valley records last winter." "Yes." Briggs's horse stamped hard in the dirt. "None of that matters." Carter ignored him. He turned the page toward the light. The faded ink lines revealed another set of signatures. Old names. County founders. Daniel's rifle lowered slightly. Not relaxed. Just waiting. Carter spoke again. "This charter shows every parcel in the North Valley." He pointed to a section near the bottom. "Except one." Marybeth leaned closer. The wind tugged at the edge of the paper. Carter tapped the blank space with his finger. "That land was set aside." Briggs barked a laugh. "For what?" Carter read the line beneath the seal. "For public settlement." The words drifted across the yard. The riders stiffened. Marybeth's voice came soft. "That means the land can't be owned by one ranch." Sheriff Carter nodded slowly. "Correct." He looked toward Briggs. "You can't claim the valley as private property." Briggs's smile vanished. "That document isn't valid." Carter held the seal up again. "This stamp came from the original county press." Briggs pulled his horse back a step. Dust kicked up beneath the hooves. Daniel noticed the movement. His rifle lifted again. "Easy." Briggs glared. "You think a scrap of paper ruins everything I built?" Marybeth stepped beside Daniel. The wind pushed her coat against her legs. "My husband died because he found the truth." Silence fell again. The barn door groaned slowly behind them. Sheriff Carter looked at Marybeth. "He died in the courthouse fire." Marybeth's voice stayed steady. "That fire started the night he told Briggs he found this." Briggs's face darkened. "Careful, widow." Daniel's voice came low. "You heard her." The riders shifted nervously. One of them glanced toward the road. The sheriff folded the document slowly. The crisp sound echoed in the quiet yard. Then he turned to Walter Briggs. "You never owned this valley." Briggs's jaw tightened. "That's not how the town sees it." Carter stepped closer. Boots pressed into the dirt. "That's exactly how the law sees it." The wind rushed across the pasture. Cattle moved uneasily beyond the fence. Briggs looked around the yard. His men. The sheriff. Daniel's rifle. And Marybeth standing unafraid. For the first time his confidence cracked. "You're making a mistake, Carter." The sheriff shook his head. "No." He placed the folded charter into Marybeth's hands. "You just lost your claim." The riders murmured quietly. Briggs's horse shifted sideways. The rancher's voice turned sharp. "This isn't over." Daniel answered calmly. "No." The wind blew harder now. Dust lifted from the road. Sheriff Carter stepped toward his horse. He placed a hand on the saddle horn. "Walter Briggs," he said quietly. "You'll ride back to town with me." Briggs stared at him. "You're arresting me?" "For falsifying land records and obstruction of county survey." The words landed heavy. Briggs looked at his men. None of them moved. The valley stayed silent. Only the wind and the creak of leather. Briggs slowly swung down from the saddle. Boots hit the ground. He glared at Marybeth. "This valley will turn on you." Marybeth held the charter close. "The valley was never yours to rule." Sheriff Carter mounted his horse. Briggs climbed onto the spare horse beside him. The riders turned slowly toward the road. Dust lifted beneath the hooves. Daniel lowered his rifle at last. The tension drained from the yard. The hoofbeats faded down the valley road. Wind moved through the grass again. Quiet returned to the ranch. Marybeth looked down at the old charter in her hands. The paper trembled slightly. Daniel stepped beside her. "You all right?" Marybeth nodded. "Yes." The barn door creaked softly behind them. The stove inside the cabin popped once. Warmth drifted through the open doorway. Marybeth looked toward the empty road. "My husband wanted the truth to come back to this valley." Daniel rested a hand lightly on the porch rail. Wood creaked beneath his grip. "Well." He glanced across the wide fields. "Looks like it just did." Spring settled gently over the valley. Morning sunlight spilled across the ranch yard. The frost that once clung to the ground had vanished. Green grass pushed through the soil. Daniel Crowe stood beside the fence post tightening a wire. The metal twanged softly as he twisted it. Cattle moved slow across the pasture. Their hooves pressed deep into the soft earth. The ranch sounded alive now. Hammer taps from the barn. Chickens clucking near the coop. Wind brushing through the tall grass. Behind him the cabin door creaked open. Marybeth Carter stepped onto the porch. A loaf of fresh bread rested in her hands. Steam curled from the crust. The smell drifted across the yard. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. "You're going to feed the whole valley at this rate." Marybeth smiled faintly. "Maybe the valley deserves it." She set the bread on the porch rail. Warm sunlight touched the wood. The boards creaked softly beneath her weight. Daniel finished twisting the wire. The fence hummed tight. A sound of order. A sound of something repaired. Marybeth watched the cattle moving across the field. "It feels different now," she said quietly. Daniel wiped his hands on a cloth. "Valley's quieter." She nodded. "Peaceful." The wind carried distant voices from the road. A wagon rolled slowly toward the ranch. Daniel looked up. Dust trailed behind the wheels. Two men climbed down when the wagon stopped at the gate. Town farmers. Their hats lifted in greeting. Marybeth stepped down from the porch. "What brings you out here?" One of the men leaned against the wagon rail. "Sheriff sent word." Daniel walked closer. The gate creaked when he pushed it open. "What word?" The farmer scratched his beard. "County's reopening the valley plots." Marybeth blinked. "For settlement?" The man nodded. "Families coming in by summer." The wagon wheels rattled softly as the men shifted. Daniel looked across the wide hills. Empty land stretched in every direction. Not empty for long. Marybeth's voice carried soft surprise. "My husband would have liked that." The farmers tipped their hats again. "Thought you might want the first pick of land." Marybeth looked at Daniel. He shrugged. "Your call." Marybeth glanced across the valley. Wind moved gently through the grass. "Let others come," she said. "This land was meant to be shared." The farmers smiled. They climbed back into the wagon. The wheels rolled away slowly down the road. Dust drifted behind them. Silence returned to the ranch. But not the lonely silence from before. This one felt warm. Alive. Daniel leaned against the fence post. "You sure about that?" Marybeth folded her arms on the rail. Yes. The porch boards creaked behind her. This place saved me. Daniel looked toward the cabin. Smoke curled softly from the chimney. I think you saved it too. Marybeth laughed quietly. The sound carried across the yard. Clear. Light. For a moment neither spoke. The valley stretched wide and bright. A hawk circled above the hills. The wind moved through the grass in long slow waves. Then the barn door creaked open. Daniel's horse stepped into the sunlight. The animal snorted softly. Marybeth walked down the steps. Her boots pressed into the warm dirt. You ever notice something? She asked. Daniel looked at her. What's that? She nodded toward the porch. Your house used to sound empty. Daniel listened. The wind brushed through the eaves. The kettle inside the kitchen rattled gently. Chickens clucked near the coop. The fence wire hummed tight under the breeze. And the porch boards creaked again as Marybeth climbed back up with the bread. Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah. Marybeth sliced the loaf with a small knife. The crust cracked. Warm crumbs scattered across the wood. She handed Daniel a piece. They ate quietly. Sunlight warmed the porch. A wagon rolled faintly along the distant road. More settlers perhaps. More lives coming to the valley. Marybeth looked toward the hills. You think trouble's really gone? Daniel considered the question. Wind lifted the grass again. The valley looked calm. Peaceful. But the world beyond it still turned rough. He shrugged slightly. Trouble comes and goes. Marybeth studied him. And you? Daniel leaned back in the chair. The porch boards creaked beneath his weight. I'll still be here. Marybeth smiled. Good. The stove popped softly inside the cabin. The kettle rattled once more. The porch creaked again as Daniel shifted his boots against the boards. This time the sound didn't echo through an empty house. It blended with the quiet rhythm of a home. Warm. Steady. Alive. And the valley that once belonged to fear now breathed easy beneath the rising sun. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.